Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind Games, where we discuss video games through the lens of the Christian humanities. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome back as we get ready for the second part of our two-part mini-series on the Legend of Zelda. Last time we had a general conversation with Josh, with David, and of course with me on Zelda, the philosophy involved, the artistic value, the mythology, and just kind of generally like why we think that this is a franchise that has had such staying power, why it has had such an impact on the culture more broadly than video games tend to. There's definitely some weight there that it resonates with human experience and human longing for a reason. And today we'll be getting more into that with some different angles with a special guest. Today we're going to be joined by Dr. Anthony Cirilla. Dr. Anthony Cirilla is Associate Professor of English at College of the Ozarks. He's a lecturer at the Davenant Institute, an Anglican priest in the United Episcopal Church in North America, and rector at his local parish. And he's also Associate Editor of Carmina Philosophiae, the Journal of the International Boethius Society. He also co-edited a book called Mythopoeic Narrative in the Legend of Zelda series in 2020, to which he contributed an essay on Tolkien's Mythopoeia in the hero's journey, with reference to the virtues of the Triforce in Ocarina of Time. This year, he has an upcoming essay anthology that he's editing on theology in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and he's currently writing a book on Boethius in the Constellation of a Quiet Life coming up in 2026. So definitely an interesting fellow. He's interested in a lot of the same kinds of things that we tend to talk about on the show, a lot of personal interests of mine, in addition to the Zelda video game storytelling, artistry connection. We definitely have Boethius in common, and I love Boethius. I read the Constellation of Philosophy on a fairly annual basis. I love teaching the Constellation, and so I'll have to have Anthony on the main show sometime to just talk Boethius. But for now, we are here to talk about Zelda and Mythopoeia. And then also, of course, we have Josh Traylor. And as I mentioned in the last episode, my experience with Zelda is just it's not as great as it is with Josh's, and so I figured it'd be good for him to take the lead on asking the questions and facilitating the conversation. So Josh will be leading us again. I realized that I haven't formally introduced Josh on this podcast, so I should probably do that. So Joshua Traylor is an incoming upper school literature teacher at Ivywood Classical Academy. He is a graduate student in the Great Books program at Memorial College, and he's currently teaching a course for us for Mythic Mind on Paradise Lost. And by the way, even though that course is well into it now, it's not too late to enroll. It's really inexpensive. It's $50 or $25 if you are a patron of Mythic Mind. And even though the course is already well into it, maybe the course is already finished by the time that you are listening to this. Once you enroll, you get all the materials indefinitely, and so there's not really a timetable on that, in that you get all these great resources. So Josh can really serve as a good guide for you in going through Paradise Lost. Now, Josh is also currently working on a chapter on the concept of the Aristotelian tragic hero, to be featured in the fourth pop culture and philosophy volume, Dark Souls and Philosophy. And so got some interesting combinations of overlapping interests represented between the three of us. I think that this led to a very productive, very worthwhile conversation on the mythopoeic nature of the Legend of Zelda. And so now let's go ahead and get to it. Welcome, Josh and Dr. Cirilla, to talk about Zelda and its mythopoeic value. Yeah, I mentioned in the last episode that we did with Josh and with David that my experience with Zelda really ends with the N64. So I've been out of the loop since Ocarina and Majora's Mask, but those games, especially Ocarina, are really they're formative experiences for our generation. Like, it still stands out to me. My cat comes when I whistle Epona's song. like these are things that stand out to you. And
Yeah.
I'm convinced that even though I haven't really been in the loop for a while, something like Zelda, like this kind of franchise that has such a hold on the culture to the point where even people who aren't gamers know what Zelda is, at least recognize it. And to me, that alone means there's something significant there that speaks to human reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't have that grip that it does. And so I look forward to digging into that conversation. But because I just don't have the expertise on this subject, I'm going to let Josh really take the reins of this interview here. I know he has some questions to ask, and I'll just jump in wherever I'm able. So Josh, you want to take it away with whatever you have for him?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Anthony. First off, I just want to I gotta throw a plug out here, but this book, this Mythopoeic Narrative in the Legends of Zelda, this is what we were referencing in the last podcast. Anthony you're one of the editors in this, right? One of two,
Yes,
right?
Vincent Roan is the other.
Yep. You can buy it on Amazon. You can probably buy it elsewhere, I would assume. But I've read through some of the essays and your introduction, which I thought was fantastic. I really like a lot of the
Thank
points
you.
that you made there. There's one quote I'm taking here, and it says, on page 7, you say that if we pit intellectualism against video games will win. And in a broader context, my understanding is that you're basically making this claim that we should, as academics in the humanities, be finding a way to connect with sort of like the video game pop culture and kind of bridge the gap between the academy and lovers of video games. And I think you have a lot of video essayists on YouTube, and some of them are really good. Like even if they don't have any sort of academic pedigree, and it's just a hobby. Some of them are very good. But even be able to bridge the gap between maybe them and academics who have just some of the education and the chops to talk about philosophical and literary concepts and kind of probe deeper into those. I think there really is a market for that out there, and I think not just a market, but just a good to our society in general. And I I'll speak for myself, and I think Andrew will nod his head if he agrees. But like I think at Mythic Mind, we're for sure very much about that very kind of thing. I wanted to bring that up and also just compliment that. It's a lovely introduction. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. And also thank you so much, Josh, for facilitating this and Andrew for having me on. This is great fun. I'm always up for talking about Zelda, so I'm really excited to dig into this.
Yeah, absolutely. On our podcast episode was 2 days ago. Andrew, David, and I talked about various things about Zelda, and we talked about our experience with the game. We usually like to kind of talk about experiences with the subject matter. Would you please just tell us a little bit about your personal experience with the Zelda game over the course of your life, or however long you've been playing that?
So, Andrew led, I think, with the creme de la creme. I mean, bowing out at Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask is nothing to be ashamed of. That was also essentially my entry point into Zelda. When I was reading, um, when I was playing Zelda, I had already been reading Tolkien. I think I was around 11 when Ocarina of Time came out. It was around that time that I was discovering Tolkien, and then shortly after Zelda. And so my experience of playing Zelda was essentially, oh, this is sort of a digital way, a virtual way to experience what Tolkien is all about. Um, so the story is pretty much I was at this Super Bowl party with my family, and I was pretty bored. I wasn't really interested in the game. I enjoy football more now, but at the time I didn't really. And my step uncle actually noticed, and he said, "Well, I've got these games," and he shared the first Zelda and A Link to the Past. He didn't share Zelda 2 with me, and then he shared Ocarina of Time, and Ocarina of Time just immediately grabbed me as this incredible adventure. And I think like The Hobbit, it has this model of giving you a place of home. You have the Shire, you have this sense of belonging in this fantasy realm, and then it pushes you out of that, the kind of there and back again feeling of it. So pretty much right away, Zelda seemed to me like it was almost allowing me to play through the experience of the kind of fantasy that I love so much in Tolkien.
Oh, sorry, cut out for a second. No, thank you so much for the answers, though. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it seems like Ocarina of Time is like rightfully so a fan favorite.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I was 3 when that game came out, but nevertheless, it somehow gripped me. If not like when I was like maybe like 5 or 6 rather than 3. But I think there's a lot of reasons for that.
Well, look at how much it's been re-released. I mean, it has staying power. You can get it on virtually every console that Nintendo has. And that tells you something that Nintendo thinks, we better keep this one alive,
Sure. Yeah, I think it's like we could like sit here and name off like some of the great books of Western literature, right? It's like the Odyssey, the Aeneid, Beowulf, Lord of the Rings, Hamlet, just the list goes on and on and on. I think if we were to do that with like video, like literary works and video games, I would hope Ocarina of Time would be considered to be critically acclaimed,
Yeah,
in that
I
same
would
way
hope
for video
so.
games.
See, I was kind of hoping that you're going to go right from great books and then just mix in Ocarina, right in there.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
for sure.
The
We have
Mortimer Adler who had the great books class and sort of we could add, the canon, add
Right.
some video games in there. Yeah.
a lot to be explored, that's for sure. Um, So another thing we're definitely doing here is going back to the title of your book, going back to Tolkien. We definitely go back to Tolkien a lot at Mythic Mind. We go back to C.S. Lewis a lot, probably those two more than anybody else, I would say. And so this term Mythopoeia is on the mind here. It's in your title. We've talked about it in other places. So for our listeners who aren't experienced with such like a concept or a topic or don't know what that word means, would you just explain what that means? Or like if somebody asked you what does that mean and they had never heard it before, like how would you answer that?
It's difficult to capture in few words, because it's a rich concept. I mean, etymologically, of course, you well know it means myth making. In a creative writing class, we might translate it, roughly speaking, as world building. But I think it's richer than that. I think Mythopoeia is about how our human capacity, to make myths is actually part of how we explain the world. Tolkien's poem, Mythopoeia, which I don't have my copy of Tree and Leaf with me. Of course, he wrote to C.S. Lewis as really an argument of epistemology that when we are deeply telling stories about elves, and I don't mean, what I mean there is not simply just because we like elves, but because there's a deep sense that elves are the right way to tell this story, or dragons are the right way to tell that story. When you pull on those resources of imagination, you are helping, the mind to better encounter reality. And I really think that's fundamentally what he's using that term to mean.
Right. He talks about subcreated reality is that fiction, good fiction at least, it's not made up. It's dealing with
Right.
reality, but on a different plane. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and Lewis says something I think is helpful here regarding the idea of myth. In Myth Became Fact, his essay, he says that myth is the isthmus that connects the peninsular world of thought with that vast continent we really belong to. It is not like truth abstract, nor is it like direct experience bound to the particular. So he says, myth is that meeting place between abstract ideas and the concrete world we actually experience. And so mythopoeia is that act of, well, putting that out there, right, as a world for you as the creator to experience, as well as for the other participants.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what Lewis is saying there, and I'm sure he is doing this intentionally, is drawing on Aristotle, right, who says of stories in general that poetry, and he means poetry in the larger sense of drama and storytelling as well as verse, right, is the middle place between history and philosophy, right? That actually poetry is more philosophical, he says, than history, right? Nothing against history, of course, but to kind of understand with that idea, in a sense, why do we need stories? Well, because we need to mediate between our reason and our senses. And the imagination does that. And I think, because this is an analogy, maybe a little ham-fisted that I use with my students. If you think of a gym, there are lots of, and if you saw, I'm glad the camera is cutting off part of my body for this. This is a good thing for this analogy. But in the gym, there's all these different machines and exercise equipment that zero in on particular muscle groups. And think in general, literature exercises our imagination so we can reason more deeply about our experience. But I think fantasy in particular helps us to reason about the function of imagination. It's sort of self-reflexive about the imagination's ability to interpret. If you read Pride and Prejudice, there's imagination there, but you can kind of forget that as you're just enjoying the characters, right? It's harder to forget when you're reading Lord of the Rings or playing Zelda. It's sort of outward facing. Your imagination matters, and I think that's why we're drawn to these things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great answer. And I like that gym and training analogy because it's like, you know, teaching at a classical school, like liberal arts focused. I think this is one of the ways we're very fundamentally different than a lot of public schools who are obviously downstream from just like progressive education philosophies of the 20th century. But
Right. Yeah.
one thing they sometimes do really well is teach people to work well with like arithmetic and some aspects of natural science. But one thing they hardly ever do well is to train the imagination. I think that's one of the things we do extremely well. And not that we're anti-STEM and humanities focused, but that we're all about, learn poetry, read great novels, read great works of philosophy, learn the broad sweep of history because it's just as important as learning chemistry, biology, geometry, physics, calculus, you name it, right? Like we see them all as extremely valuable in making the well-rounded liberal man, like the vir liberalis and the Latin. Like that's so I think there's an important point here, and this is also why I want to have these kind of discussions because sometimes literature and specifically poetry just does not get the light it deserves in our culture.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It makes what you're saying makes me think of the Jesuit phrase, the cura personalis, the care of the whole person. And I think that the dangers of scientism, which is not a friend of science, is that it forgets, and this is Tolkien's point in Mythopoeia, that actually you couldn't get to these other arts without the poetic experience. If you become a scientist or a mathematician, it's because your imagination was awakened and captured to that. Um, and it's not good to have a kind of ingratitude to the wonder that woke up that interest to begin with. And I think
Yeah.
classical education grabs that and sort of it sort of keeps circulation moving between all the systems of the mind. I think a little more effectively than the what's become the traditional model.
Yeah, I mean, it strives to make sense of that Platonic question of like, what is the good that makes good things good? It answers the
Yeah.
question, when the student is asking, why do I need to learn this? Well, you can actually provide an answer because it's all ultimately sourced in the good. It's why the medievals would say that theology is the mother science and philosophy is its handmaiden, and that everything else ultimately comes from there, from the question of wisdom, which itself is answered theologically. And so everything, all facets of knowledge are actually connected. As opposed to the very nominalist, like let's just engage in all these different particular things with no unifying purpose.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I forget who pointed out the fact. It's interesting thing about the fact that Plato and Aristotle come about 400 years after Homer, and to kind of think about their philosophical dispute as basically a debate on how to read the myths. And so yeah, there's this kind of this whole sense of seeking the good that even Plato, as much as he critiques the myths, is also deeply, deeply engaged with them. And so in that sense, philosophy is born out of a desire to understand the human story, essentially. Yeah.
No, I feel like we could very generally get to these philosophical ideas for the rest of this conversation. So Josh, do you want to point this more directly towards Zelda?
I certainly can, but no, thank you so much for bringing those up. I think this kind of ties in. You may have even answered some of this question, in what we just said in the past couple of minutes, which is totally fine. But so I grew up really attracted to the Legend of Zelda. I grew up attracted to Studio Ghibli movies like
Mm,
Princess Mononoke,
hmm.
things like that, like fantastical settings, both in a Western sense, like knights, swords, and shields, but also in the very limited things that I do know about Japanese culture. I was attracted to things like samurai or warfare in feudal Japan and all of these things, right? So there's kind of a blend of both of those elements in Zelda. But um, you know, why did I have such a difficult time explaining why I liked these things growing up? Why, musically, aesthetically, and just the world building. I was always like, oh, I just like the world, and people said, oh, that's not substantial. Why would somebody like me have felt that way?
Yeah, well, I think our minds are an object of mystery to ourselves to a great extent. I mean, given that, the Imago Dei, certainly I wouldn't claim to understand God in a complete way, because he's mysterious, and we in some sense are a reflection of that. And so I think the question of what captures our attention, there's an aspect to that we can't, because it's pulling on resources that go deeper than that sort of like the ego sort of pinpoint of attention on something. And I think I would say that that's also true of other basic experiences in life. We know scientifically why we like water, but when you're thirsty and it's satisfying, you can't really explain the experience. It's just good after this run. Or why do you like to go out into the sunlight? Well, your skin absorbs vitamin D, but that doesn't explain the full sense of after you kind of had a hard day and you walk out into the light and something is just being satisfied, and it takes time to figure out exactly what's going on there. And I think the same is true of these fantastic images that, and this is kind of evocative of Lewis talking about like the meeting of desire. I remember having from early memories as a child, scenes from The Last Unicorn, and I didn't know what it was. I would describe, oh, there's a unicorn and a butterfly, and no one knew what I was talking about. But for some reason, those images just resonated with something in me, and I wanted to know what I was remembering. When I finally got to see the movie, I wasn't disappointed, and then I read the novel, and it got even deeper. So I think there's a lot of there, in some sense, our imagination, I think moves faster than our reason. It kind of grabs onto a sense of, oh, this is important and there's something rich here. And it takes a lot of time to unfold it and kind of delve and excavate what's going on in there. And I think Zelda games kind of have that aspect. One of the features of Zelda as a game that I love is this aspect of a territory that you've passed through 6 or 7 times, and then you find out that there's a secret, and that secret reminds you that that environment itself is wonderful, and you just have gotten used to it. And so, yeah, I think it's about awakening of an intuition that will require further meditation to get into. It's sort of like how scripture talks about, chewing the cud. You need to return to scripture. I'm not putting, of course, Zelda on the same level naturally, but I think there's a similar effect in that, our there are resources in our mind and that sort of deeper archetypal resonance with things that we feel out a sense of meaning, and then we need to circle back and kind of, explore it again, like you do with places in Zelda.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Great answer. It kind of just reminds me to so like we think of this like as poet, like with poetry specifically, where a poem is not like it can be analyzed in a sense, and maybe in some way it should be, but a poem, it's more than like it's not like a puzzle, right? Like that's something like we try to
Right.
do, at least in my circle of classical education. Like we don't analyze it and solve it like a puzzle. It's more like taking a step back, appreciating a beautiful painting, like zooming in different places. I always love the T.S. Eliot quote where he says, "Poetry communicates before it is understood." Right, and it's like I think that's there's a connection there with something like the world of Zelda where it works on you and you understand it more, and there's something about
Yeah.
the imagery and symbolism there. I'm also a fan of the Dark Souls games, and though
Mhm.
more dark fantasy, much less cartoonish, wouldn't recommend it to children like I would with most of the Zelda games, but it's the
Yeah.
same reason why I love Dark Souls is it's it does the same thing with fantasy, and it's I think really a fantasy world in the truest sense because of that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean that sub-creative instinct that Tolkien talks about so well in on fairy stories, right? I saw Andrew had a video essay about this, I think in March he posted this on your podcast. And I think that it's interesting to think about the relationship between world building in virtual space versus on the written page. And I'm still thinking through how Tolkien would think about that because he obviously says the written word is superior to drama for fairy stories, right? And I agree with him on that fundamentally. But I also think that where the human mind goes, we will need myth there to deal with it. And I think one thing Zelda helps us to do is to think about these digital spaces that are so, between social media and our bank accounts and everything, the online space. Um, Dark Souls, which I know about from friends, I haven't actually played, but in Zelda, they kind of help us to deal with the fact that so much of our lives are in computers now, and we need adventure there because the human condition, it won't tolerate not having adventure. We need it everywhere we go, you know?
Yeah, that connection to the broader digital space, I think it's worthwhile. A lot of there's definitely this certain, I don't know, I guess prejudice toward video games. That they're
Yeah.
childish, they're a waste of time, that sort of thing. That you know if we're really honest with ourselves, are we benefiting ourselves more with an hour of Twitter or an hour of
Yeah.
Zelda? Which is
Yeah.
more grounding, which allows us to get more in tune with ourselves? And I think that's a question worth asking.
Yeah, exactly. I'll trade in my doom scrolling for fighting Ganondorf pretty much any time. That's a great point. Yeah. Mm.
So as a follow-up, just to probe a little bit deeper into the Zelda aspects of this, um, what would you say are some of the either the most obvious and or the most profound mythopoeic elements in the Legend of Zelda series? And as far as like picking a specific game or specific elements, you can kind of take that wherever you want.
Well, I think one that comes to mind immediately, of course, is the Triforce. I mean, that's such an iconic symbol that even people who've never played Zelda usually know what it is. If they see it, like I have the Triforce on my wallet, and someone will say, "Is that the Triforce?" And they don't say, "Is that a Triforce?" They say the Triforce, like they understand, the language, even if they've not encountered the game. And I think that idea of manifesting higher order concepts in a physical way, the talisman, that sort of enchanted object that makes it's almost you mentioned Plato, Andrew. It's sort of like this kind of Platonic manifestation of the harmony of courage, wisdom, and power. And I think in that sense, what it's as a mythopoeic symbol, the Triforce is teaching us about what Plato would call the unity of the virtues. To say that, well, you can't really use power well if you're not courageous. You're going to use it in a cowardly way, which Ganondorf falls into. He ends up trapping himself in a tower because he knows that he's created a lot of hatred for himself. And you're also not going to use power well if you're not wise. But likewise, you can't really be courageous if you're not willing to develop your power. And you actually, Plato talks about this too. You can't actually have a person who is brave but not wise. But you also can't have a person who's wise but not brave. And I love Plato and I love reading about Plato, but I think there is something about the true um, nature of those virtues kind of clicking together and enriching each other, that the Triforce just makes sense for me in a way that I didn't get exactly out of reading Plato, even though he helped me interpret the idea. And so I think that sort of concrete imagery, you understand the idea that a triangle is not a triangle without 3 points. And so the virtue is not the virtue without its two related virtues, right? And so I think that idea of making a wish, well, in a sense, if you enjoin any particular action, if you pursue any outcome, if you're going to do it well, you're going to have to, in some sense, have power to do it. You're going to have a little courage. Like, it's a little scary to be on this podcast. What if I say something silly and now it's out there for the world, you know? And well, I'm going to have to use my wisdom to try and say something that makes a little bit of sense. And I'm going to have the fortitude, which is a kind of power, to deal with it if I say something a little clunky, and that's okay, you know? And so I think that idea then has like almost like a mathematical equation, a lot of repeatable application in other places, you know? A little more concretely, though, Tolkien talks about the arresting image, you know, that sort of arresting strangeness. And in Ocarina of Time, on the tree that Link lives in, at the base, there's this little drawing he did, maybe from one of his visions, of a little figure, kind of himself, fighting a monster with Navi, a little fairy companion. That's the base arresting image from which the fantasy of Zelda is built, right? And you might say, well, what a childish little drawing. Well, of course, but childish drawings are where the great painter started. And if you let that childish drawing continue, it might then go from childish to childlike, and to have a childlike wonder for drawing, you know, as an adult. And I think the same is true of the adventures that, you know, that Zelda is calling us to.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me of, and I'm gonna like paraphrase it a little bit because I don't know exactly what the direct quote is, but C.S. Lewis kind of talks about this idea of like writing out of these images in a sense, where it's like
Yeah,
people are like, oh, so you just like elaborately thought out this entire like allegory for like the entire Christian story, and he's kind of like, no, like it's like I'm a Christian, but like I was really just thinking about like this image of like a fawn in this lamppost in like the winter, something along those lines, and like just Narnia just built out of that, right? It's not just like he's not just sitting there like scientifically precisely just
yeah.
writing everything out, being like, how can I tie this in with my Christian beliefs? So it flows out of us, right? Like it's more than it's cerebral in a sense, but it's more than that and different than that in some other ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's why we talk about an artistic vision, not an artistic argument, right? I mean, I was thinking there's kind of, course, you were asking, you know, why do I find these things so captivating without being able to articulate them? And I think it's probably in the same essay collection where I think it's on stories, in that collection, where Lewis says, well, good artists put what they mean to into a text, but great ones put more than they mean, right? And there's an aspect that a great artist actually learns how to take that maybe youthful kind of wonderment and capture it enough to retain it within the net of words or the virtual space they create without controlling it too closely. You know, if there's a place where George MacDonald, I think it's called The Fantastic Imagination, where he says that fairy tales are kind of like butterflies, right? You kind of have to let the butterfly be a butterfly. And it's like if you're looking at a butterfly and someone comes along and says, well, what's your reason for looking at that butterfly? Give me an argument. You're like, well, you don't understand what it is to stare at butterflies. Like they're just beautiful and it just does something for you. And the appreciator of art and the artist need to both kind of have that instinct, you know?
Yeah, in probably the same essay you were alluding to, I always mix up his on stories and on three ways of writing for children. But one of
Yeah,
those, he says that a bad storyteller is going to ask the question, "What do people need to hear?" And then you can get very condescending and really just propagandic. Or you can ask, what's better is, okay, what's the story that I need to hear? At least then it's a bit more existential, more introspective, a bit more humble. But he says that the best storytellers ask the question, what's the story that I have to tell? And that's
yeah,
naturally going to pull out of your spiritual, imaginative roots.
yeah, yeah. I think there's this aspect of trusting our imaginative instincts as having something real to them. And I think this is a point that, for example, Wordsworth deals with a lot in his writing. Those memories that stick with you, they stick with you for a reason. You might have the wrong reason, but don't abandon the memory for that reason. And I think the same is true of those bits of fantasy that just something about them sparkles and draws the eye, and we should probably listen to that. Again, it's kind of like the butterfly and the last unicorn. Don't listen to me, listen, and I think the author kind of has to say that too.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess I'm gonna kind of have you make an apologia here for us, just because there's something I've heard from a lot of people who, and it's certainly a good thing in a lot of ways to be into games that have just really explicitly well told, complex stories with a lot of obvious philosophical depth. I mean, we've talked about like Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2, especially 2 in that regard on this, and that's a great example of that to me. But
Yeah,
something I hear is that sometimes people will be like, well, yeah, Zelda has more writing and substance to it that's obvious than like something like Mario or, maybe Donkey Kong in some ways, but Zelda's still a little bit generic with generic characters. It has a very predictable story. The protagonist is boring. It's not well written like some of these, like something like a Final Fantasy game might be, right? Which has a
sure.
bunch of dialogue and like well fleshed out backstories. Um, so how would you defend that, right? Like what would be your defense that you would give if somebody said that to you, like just randomly somewhere?
Yeah, I think that in a way that argument often it sort of sounds like the argument against Tolkien as well, where it's sort of like, well, all the characters are sort of flat with a couple of exceptions. Like there's only Boromir or something, right? But actually, most of the characters are much more complicated than it first appears, right? So, I mean, for one, Frodo is much more plagued by the nightmare of the One Ring than you really ever understand until you get to Sam's brief experience with it and it's filling his head with these thoughts. And you realize Frodo, as writing Lord of the Rings, is actually withholding from the page probably a lot of torment and anguish that you don't really see. And I think what it is Tolkien often treats his characters with dignity and subtlety, and you have to sit with it to kind of see what's really going on. He's not hasty about sort of voyeuristically going into the inner workings of a particular character. And I think in the same way, Zelda is often very subtle with its portrayal of what's going on. So there's environmental storytelling, and there are things that you can miss. Zelda wants you to pay attention to see you could be missing something, which is actually a lot more like real life if you think about it. Like you have a person who you're sort of frustrated with them, and you think, oh, they're always late. They're always late all the time, and you're just annoyed by it. And what a corny thing to be late all the time. What a stock trope. And you have the same thing with Link at the opening of Ocarina of Time. He's a lazy boy, says Navi. How can Hyrule depend on him, right? Well, that's a little bit stock. But actually, the more you think about it, this is someone whose mother died when he was in infancy, who is with the people who is not his own. He's deeply alone. He doesn't even have a fairy, which is a wonderful stroke of mythopoeic genius too, because it's like this, no one in this world has a fairy. But then they immediately are like, this poor bully who doesn't even have a fairy. And we're like, oh no, how could that be? And he's also having nightmares throughout the night, which is stopping him from sleeping well, and that's why he's sleeping during the day, right? And so it may look generic, but actually the game is telling us, pay attention. There's more to the ins and outs that's going on in a person's life, and I actually think that there's a kind of storytelling impatience where we want a lot of flash and bang. But if you pay attention to the particulars of each story, you'll find that there is a lot of nuance and a lot of subtlety there. But the other thing I want to say about it too is, and this is, I guess, maybe kind of a Lewis type move. Let's say something for the generic. I mean, the word generic comes from genre, which means, a category of story, but genre also comes from the word gene and the word gender. So you're like a story about a man and a woman falling in love. How generic. Well, that's also how procreation and new life comes into being. Let's not sneer at these basic things. And, just as your body needs water and your soul needs transcendence, your imagination needs a boy with his fairy fighting a dragon. And I don't think we should roll our eyes at those archetypes, which are different from stereotypes, as generic. I think it's kind of like, I guess, and sorry, I'm kind of talking long on this one, but it's a little bit like the difference between a cliche and a proverb. You know, a real cliche is just a lazy grab at, like, it's like a false wisdom. Proverb, you might be tired of hearing it, but if you really sit with it, you'll see that it's a truth you do not want to give up. And I would say that the generic qualities of Ocarina of Time and other Zelda games are exactly that.
Yeah, all very well said. In my opinion, you've successfully defended yourself. Of course,
Thank you.
Socrates would have many more questions for you, but I also believe that Socrates would have better taste than those kinds of questions too. So
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to choose to believe that, and I think that's just very justifiable.
I'm with you.
So we hinted this way earlier about this idea of you know, video games having meaning, trying to connect the academy with that. Um, should at least, and we'll say at least the mainline Zelda games here, but should the mainline Zelda games be a part of our children's education, like their literary education growing up, like having them play those video games as part of their upbringing and training them for being adults one day and doing virtuous things in the world.
I think so. I would say actually probably not some of the more recent Zeldas. I think Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom actually are, as much as I enjoyed those games, I don't know if you've touched them at all, but they are a bit more sprawling, and so I think they actually kind of have the temptation for indulgence that video games are more associated with. But yeah, I want my son or daughter to learn the temerity to go ahead and walk into the darkness of the Deku Tree and feel the fear of seeing Queen Goma gazing with that malevolent eye from the ceiling, and learn it's that Chestertonian desire for our children to be brave enough to face the monsters. Just as I want my child to know the Hobbit, I think there are things in Zelda that are wholesome and good for them to be able to encounter.
So I do want to ask a quick follow-up based off what you said about the newer Zelda games, which I haven't played. Would you say that the value of video games like Zelda is principally found in the more, I guess, linear stories versus the open world games? Is that kind of what you were hinting at?
Yeah, yeah, roughly speaking, I mean, I did find value in playing those more open world games, which, I mean, in some sense, all the 3D Zeldas are kind of open world, but they are still linear, as you said, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, those games, they're less symbolically saturated because there's just a lot of plot. So the essay on stories that you alluded to by C.S. Lewis talks about the difference of really kind of experiencing, like, why this thing, right? Why the danger of a giant versus the danger of an army, right? And I think the more linear games preserve that sense of the ratio of sort of plot and gameplay to symbolic register, whereas I think those larger, more sprawling games kind of lose some of that. I think they actually lose some of that placement of poetry to philosophy and delve almost into kind of like a mythopoeic history, which is interesting and has its value, but is just less symbolically rich and a little more vulnerable to indulgence, basically. I think. Yeah.
It's definitely an interesting perspective, and this is something I've thought of a lot just playing video games too. Because I'm usually maybe sometimes in the minority camp, not always broadly in this way, but usually I actually prefer a lot of the installments in a series that are not the big open world one. Like I love the three Dark Souls games, Demon Souls and Bloodborne, and I did like Elden Ring a lot, but I actually, it was the first truly open world from soft RPG, and it was actually the one that I probably enjoyed the least in a sense. And I did feel I never played Tears of the Kingdom, but I did play Breath of the Wild, and I felt quite similarly about that as I did with Elden Ring as well. And so maybe there is something to that, right? Like I think I kind of like it when the as you said the symbolism, the aesthetics, such things are kind of more condensed, maybe a little bit more saturated into just like less area and less world to be explored in a sense. Still a lot, still a very vast adventure game type of world, somewhat linear in a way, but yeah, I usually kind of like my world's less open. So maybe you just provide me a reason to think on more about that.
Yeah, well, what you're saying makes me think about Tolkien's distinction, and I know you gentlemen are very familiar with this, but the primary and secondary world idea, and I think that Ocarina of Time, for example, ends, and you think, 1998, Ocarina of Time comes out. It's probably mostly like young-ish players initially. There's a range there, of course. I'm still playing Ocarina of Time. I just was playing some of it yesterday, that I never stopped. But that the ending sequence where Link has returned to an age that's probably the age of your average player is then saying, okay, now go put the game down. You finished it. Now go live a life with this understanding in hand. Whereas I think that the kind of repeated endlessness of Breath of the Wild is more like, well, now go find another shrine or go play the game more, And I think there is value to how a game like that helps us to kind of contextualize and enrich the ideas of the previous games. But I think there's a deeper love for the primary world in some of those more structured games where they are not trying to, it's this kind of like Lewis on authorship, right? The game is not trying to simply be a spectacle, but be a pair of spectacles for the world that you actually live in. And I think it's a little easier to do that with those more symbolically defined gaming experiences than say like World of Warcraft, which I think is actually kind of toxically endless, and I'm not trying to be negative to anyone who's a fan of that. There's value to it for sure, but kind of bothers me in that way.
Yeah, in my response to that, I think that I largely agree that a very structured story is perhaps more poetic. I think that where the open world kind of games can go well is when there's a real emphasis on the story that develops from the decision making that you do. Like when it becomes that kind of
Yeah,
open-ended,
yeah,
right? Because at that point you get into the realm of like responsibility and morality and whatnot. But yeah, if the game is
yeah.
just
Like the
open
Fable
of
games. Yeah,
right. But if the game is open in the sense of, yeah, you just keep like doing the same repetitive tasks, then that's not very uplifting. But yeah, so I think it largely depends on, I mean, even if it's a structured story, depends on what's the story that's being told. That it all comes down to like, what is the purpose? Is the purpose to do something meaningful, or is the purpose just to kind of get into these endless addiction cycles?
yeah, yeah. I will say, even though I have these critiques, Breath of the Wild and its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, do have um these shrines, they've been critiqued for having them because they're not as good as dungeons. But you do have this continual sort of repetitive experience of finding the sacred space and getting either a spirit orb or a light of blessing. And I read an essay, I don't know who it was off the top of my head, but they were comparing it to taking Holy Communion as this kind of like repetitive experience of seeking out the sacred again and again. And I thought that was kind of an interesting point, that I think that sometimes a recognition that um, sacred experiences are actually often more frequent than we notice. And those larger open world games can maybe give us um, maybe a richer experience of that mapping on, you know. I just think then it falls a little more to the player to internally figure out, how do I regulate my attachment to playing this game, rather than the game itself kind of saying, okay, now it's time to stop and kind of think about what it means, you know.
Yeah, I think that, well, I can appreciate what that framing is trying to do in trying to put a positive spin on these repetitive things that you can find in games. I think
Yeah.
that where it falls short is the repetition that we engage with things like communion is, well, there's actually substance there,
Right, right, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. Like actually breathing in and breathing out every day, all day, is actually keeping you alive in a way that the repetition of a you know role playing, grinding game kind of doesn't do.
Right, because whether we're talking about things that keep us alive physically or spiritually, at that point, we're not just engaging with the imagination, which is where games do their best in engaging with imagination. And so I don't know, I can't totally buy the I'm gonna keep going to these shrines in Zelda, and that's like communion. I appreciate what it's trying to do in theory, but I feel like
Yeah,
it's mixing categories of what it is that games are meant to accomplish.
yeah, yeah. I fundamentally agree with that. Yeah,
I appreciate those thoughts. There's a lot to consider, I think, there from both sides of like the open world and the non-open world, if you may. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, too, like this is an open world game. It's really about probably not even much as like open world as it is like how substantial can you make that open world. Even a game like Elden Ring, I can see that it's there. It's just that honestly, a lot of that for me is kind of subjective because the season of life in which I played it, and I just had way less time to play that game than I did when I think it was in like fifth or sixth grade when Oblivion was released on the Xbox 360, and I had plenty of time to play a couple hundred hours of Oblivion, and I also played World of Warcraft and RuneScape around those same times, and exploring all the options in Oblivion was certainly a lot more than how I don't even want to know countless hours that I spent just chopping wood and selling you logs in RuneScape. So I lot to chew on there, lot to think about before I begin to say more.
yeah. And I mean, I do think there is something to be said for having a little bandwidth for just for play, and to kind of delight in that to some extent is not necessarily bad. And it reminds me of, I had a discussion with a student who was frustrated by someone who was she was talking with, who was saying that like playing Minecraft is like just as satisfying as actually building something with your hands, which of course, I think I would have to say, as a lover of the primary world, that that's absurd. Of course, building something with your hands is more important than playing Minecraft. However, I do think that building something in Minecraft can give you an experience that can help you to imagine building things more richly, and that is valuable too, right? Provided you take it as something to enrich rather than to replace. And I think that's where, like, kind of what Andrew's saying about Holy Communion, you don't want these virtual spaces to feel like they're replacing the adventure. And I think that's a really it can be difficult to suss out.
And I think that if we're really honest with ourselves, that discernment's not difficult to really, whatever we're engaging with, ask myself, is whatever I'm doing, is this actually benefiting my life? And if you're honest with yourself, you generally know the answer to that question.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that that's a good safeguard about where we could get lost in these virtual spaces versus where they can inspire us. I mean, I've talked to many people who have gone on to get PhDs in history in part because they played Civilization as a kid. Like these things can inspire us in the right direction. Which we have to be honest with ourselves regarding what direction they're taking us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
So, Anthony, what would you recommend if somebody wanted to um, get into what we've talked about further? And obviously, references to the Lewis and Tolkien essays and sources, but specifically getting further into one study on these topics in Zelda, but just in video games broadly as well.
Yeah, well, I have a couple of books here on my desk. I could do a little show and tell if that would be all right. This one is called The Psychology of Zelda, Anthony Bean, and it's got a great hero's journey essay on there, and I think that idea of thinking about the archetypes, and some of those more kind of Jungian approaches to Zelda is really really good. Another one that I like is this book. It's called The Legend of Zelda Anthology. So these are mostly Zelda and books. This is Jonathan Walls, and there's a wonderful essay yeah, by Philip is it Philip Talon? Let me see here. I think I've got that right. Yeah, Philip Talon on, which is kind of a great last name for Zelda. Subcreation and Tolkien there, so that's one. And then also Luke Cuddy's Legend of Zelda and Philosophy. And he's got a nice piece there on kind of some of the questions we're talking about on can video games be art? Which of course I would say yes to that, and so does he. So those are three good books. There are uh, things like Game Studies, which is an online journal that one can read. There's also, though, in the more mythopoeic vein, Mythlore, the journal of the Mythopoeic Society, right? So those are some places that you can go. I'm not really a video game scholar by trade. I'm a medievalist that kind of played around in the camp of video game scholarship a little bit. But those are some examples I would give.
I gotta say, I absolutely love the wordplay on like different like pop culture and philosophy titles. I link before I
Yeah,
have to
I
sit
linked there
out
for
loud.
I
And
am.
I'm
Yeah.
not a Hunger Games guy by any means. Genuinely don't know much about it, but the pop culture and philosophy, there's it's like the Hunger Games and philosophy, and it's like a critique of pure treason. Like I love these things. Some people are probably
That's
cringing
nice.
right now at that, but
Oh, that's fun.
I don't
That
care if they are. Also, it's fine if you
I
do or like it.
you know, it's Samuel Johnson, I think, who said that puns are the lowest form of wit, and I respectfully disagree. I think puns are great little reminders of the philosophy of words, which obviously Tolkien teaches us all about. Um,
There's an art to using a pun well. It's just like any other like poetic device, right? I mean, um, irony is sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes irony is just poorly done, but it doesn't mean that irony is not good in a sense. There's really strong uses of irony, and there's some weak ones. There's a lot in between. And I think puns are the same way.
And the same with games, right? I mean, games can be indulgent and ridiculous, and the player of the game can be indulgent and fail to find deeper meaning. But abuse doesn't cancel use, as Tolkien reminds us.
So, other than Zelda, are there any other major games or franchises that you would endorse or that have a special place for you?
Well, one series that I actually am quite fond of and was recently remastered for the Switch, well, for several platforms. This would be more along the lines of what Josh was saying about Dark Souls. But I really am fond of the Legacy of Kain series, Blood Omen 1 and 2, Soul Reaver 1 and 2, and Defiance. And they're much darker. They're not, as sort of whimsical as the Zelda games are, but they have a kind of maybe a sort of undead mythopoeic kind of imagination and dealing with a lot of questions about fate and free will and the image of vampire as this distortion of what it means to be human, that I really am fascinated by. I think a lot of the questions that those kinds of stories bring up about like what is the soul? what is the soul's relationship to the body, which that the mind body problem also has to do with questions we were talking about, like what is a poem? Is the poem the reading of the poem or the text, you know? And so I think those games have a lot of rich value to them. Um, Another series, I actually wrote an essay on Boethian philosophy and a video game called Medieval that was for the PlayStation re-released a few years ago, where you play a reanimated skeleton who was defeated embarrassingly in battle, like right at the beginning. He was leading the charge and dies, and then he gets to come back and fight his way, you know, through the hordes. So that's another game that I have appreciation for. Yeah.
Cool. Josh, do you have any other questions that we haven't gotten to yet?
No, I've gone through all of mine, so wherever you guys want to go, or if you want to end it now, it's up to you.
All right, fantastic. Anthony, is there anything else that you feel like we should talk about?
Um, you know, I don't have anything off the top of my head. I had some notes here that just in case you ask me any hard questions that stump me, but these were all really fun. Um, Yeah, I guess the one thing I'll just end with of what I want to say is that I think this conversation really is such a, I mean, for it's such a blessing to me to be able to talk with you all about this, and that this is kind of that sense of what draws us together, that as we feel the kind of that kind of almost mystical sense of what you know, brings us to something like Zelda or to The Hobbit. And you know, Lewis taught, is it Lewis and Surprised by Joy or something? He says, so when friendship is born, when you say, what, you too? I thought I was the only one, you know? And saying that reading William Morris or something, you know? And I think in this sense, it's really in some sense, fantasy is a vehicle by which we discover that friendship really is a wonderful thing and a gift, you know, and the kind of friendship that comes out of discovering these beautiful things, I think is a real, just a real incredible blessing that we should have grateful appreciation for. So,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
yeah.
Yeah, excuse me. I think that's a good way to wrap. Definitely appreciate you coming on the show, and we'll have to have you again sometime, maybe on the other show to talk Boethius. I feel like that's something that we need to
Oh,
do.
I'm always up for talking about atheists.
All right, fantastic. All right, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Josh, and we'll go ahead and wrap it there. Uh,
Thank you,
Take
gentlemen.
care.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Josh, for facilitating the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Cirilla, for joining us and talking about the mythopoeic nature of the Legend of Zelda series. Next, we'll be doing a three-parter on Mass Effect, covering each of those games. And so I look forward to where we're going with that. Make sure that if you're not already, that you are subscribed to the main Mythic Mind podcast, as well as the Mythic Mind movies and shows podcast to get the full range of what we're doing, or even better yet, become a patron over at patreon.com/mythicmind. When you become a patron at any level, you get access to all of these shows, all delivered through one podcast feed, early and ad-free. And so if you get kind of tired of these ads, if you get tired of skipping through these ads, then get rid of them altogether by becoming a patron at any level. And if you become a patron at the tier 3 level on an annual basis, become an annual tier 3 patron, you also get access to everything that we have to offer, as well as you get access to all of my courses that begin within that yearly term. So right now, that's Plato Stoicism Until We Have Faces, the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy, and the Silmarillion. So go ahead and join today, support what we're doing, and get access to all of that stuff. But that's it for now. See you next time for Mass Effect. Until then, Godspeed. I have always, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. It was on happy days when we were up in the hills, the three of us, with the wind and the sunshine, where you couldn't see Gloam or the palace. Do you remember? The color and the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. Everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. But I couldn't come, and I didn't know where I was to come to. It almost hurt me. I felt like a bird in a cage when the other birds of its kind are flying home. And now I will make answer to you, O my judges, and show that he who has lived as a true philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to receive the greatest good in the other world. For I deem that the true disciple of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is ever pursuing death and dying. And if this is true, why, having had the desire of death all his life long, should he regret the arrival of that which he has always been pursuing and desiring? The longing of Plato and the control of the Stoics pervades Lewis's retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth until we have faces. With this incredible novel, which he believed to be his best, Lewis demonstrates the tensions in ancient thought and, even more significantly, the limits of rational philosophy, which can only go as deep as the foxes can dig. Beyond that, under that, and providing the life of that thought, we find the dark and holy places that blind our faculties of reason. What then shall we do? This is a topic that we will explore after first surveying some important philosophical contributions in the ancient world that have had some significant bearing on Lewis's great novel. To this end, we will begin with Plato's Phaedo, which discusses the immortality of the soul and what those who love wisdom might expect in the life to come. And then we'll spend 4 weeks with some of the great Stoics, including Epictetus, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. Finally, we will turn our attention to Till We Have Faces for the final 2 weeks with original content, and so this will not be the same as what you may have seen in the Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis course. Each week of this 8-week study will include readings from primary sources that will be provided as PDFs, although these are all texts that belong in your personal library. You'll be provided with recommendations for secondary readings, you'll have recorded presentations for you to watch at your leisure, ongoing Discord chats, and weekly live meetings to discuss the readings. Enroll today by going to patreon.com/mythicmind and checking out the shop, or you can gain access to all courses, past, present, and future this year by purchasing a Tier 3 annual subscription. I hope to see you there.